What happens when power wears perfume and prejudice wears a smile until it slips and shows its teeth? Naomi Rivers stepped into the luxury store with steady breath and calm eyes, her hand resting protectively on her belly, dressed simply yet with quiet elegance, while the marble floors shone brighter than the faces watching her like she did not belong. Whitlock stood behind the counter in a tailored suit with perfect makeup and a voice trained to sound polite while cutting deep, her eyes scanning Naomi from head to toe and deciding within seconds that this woman was an inconvenience rather than a customer. The store hummed with soft music and whispered judgments as assistants paused their work to stare, the kind of silence that weighs heavier than noise. Naomi moved slowly between racks of silk and leather, touching nothing, asking politely for help, while Claire watched with folded arms and a thin smile that never reached her eyes. When Naomi asked to see a dress in the window, Claire laughed softly and said the collection was reserved for serious buyers, her words dripping with meaning that needed no explanation. Naomi kept her voice calm and replied that she was here to buy, not to be judged, and the air shifted as if the store itself held its breath. Claire stepped closer, lowering her voice but sharpening her tone, accusing Naomi of loitering, of touching expensive items, of making other customers uncomfortable, even though no one else had complained. Naomi tried to explain, choosing dignity over anger, but Claire's patience snapped in a way that revealed long-buried prejudice, and in one sudden shocking moment, she raised her hand and struck Naomi across the face. The sound echoed off glass and marble, freezing time, as assistants gasped and customers stared in horror. Naomi staggered but did not fall, her hand still on her belly, her eyes lifting slowly to meet Claire, with a strength that made the room uneasy. Claire immediately began shouting excuses, claiming security concerns, claiming rules, claiming authority, but her voice trembled because something had gone wrong. Naomi did not scream or cry, instead she spoke softly, saying this place had shown its true face, and that actions like this always come with consequences. Security rushed forward too late, unsure who to restrain, while phones began to rise, recording everything, because truth travels fast when injustice is loud. Claire tried to regain control, ordering Naomi out, threatening bans and police calls, unaware that every second was sealing her fate. Naomi turned toward the exit slowly, each step measured, every eye following her, and before leaving she looked back once and said that respect costs nothing but ignorance costs everything. Outside the store, the city moved as normal, unaware that a line had just been crossed that could not be erased. If you want to see how silence turns into power and arrogance collapses under truth, make sure you subscribe and comment justice, because this story is only beginning, and what comes next will shock everyone who thought status could protect cruelty. Naomi Rivers walked out of the luxury store with her head held high even though her cheek burned and her heart pounded, because she knew that panic would only feed the kind of people who thrived on power without consequence. Inside the store, Whitlock stood frozen for a moment, her polished confidence cracking as murmurs filled the air, assistants whispering to each other, customers pulling out phones, and security unsure whether to follow orders or follow the truth unfolding in front of them. Claire forced her spine straight and lifted her chin, barking commands for staff to return to work, insisting the situation was handled, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her as she realized control was slipping through her fingers. Outside, Naomi paused on the pavement, resting a hand on her belly, breathing through the shock, not out of weakness but out of calculation, because she understood that survival sometimes meant restraint and timing meant everything. She made a single quiet phone call, her voice steady, not dramatic, simply stating what had happened, where it had happened, and who had done it, and on the other end the silence that followed was heavier than any shouting could have been. Back inside, Claire tried to laugh it off with a wealthy regular customer, dismissing the incident as a misunderstanding, but the woman looked at her differently now, suspicion replacing comfort, because cruelty once revealed is hard to hide again. The store manager arrived, having heard fragments of the story, and Claire rushed to explain first, shaping the narrative, painting herself as protector of the brand, but the eyes around her no longer accepted her words so easily. Security reviewed the cameras quietly, their faces tightening as angles replayed the moment of violence again and again, the sound of the slap louder each time it echoed in memory. Messages began spreading online, short clips with no commentary, just truth, just evidence, just a woman struck for daring to exist where she was deemed unwelcome. Naomi returned home and sat in silence for a while, feeling the weight of the day settle, knowing that her life had taught her patience, strategy, and the cost of being underestimated. And she chose not to cry because tears were a luxury she would save for safety. Claire's phone buzzed constantly as colleagues messaged her warnings, some offering support, others distancing themselves already, and she told herself this would pass, that brands protected their own, that money smoothed everything over. But unease crept in when she noticed the store emails piling up, requests for statements, internal reviews, meetings scheduled without her input, because systems move fast when liability appears. Naomi finally looked up and whispered that some people confuse silence for weakness, not realizing it is often preparation. And if you are watching this moment unfold and want to see how truth dismantles arrogance brick by brick, make sure you subscribe and comment truth, because what happens next will prove that power built on prejudice always collapses when faced with accountability. Naomi Rivers woke before dawn with the city still quiet outside her window, her hand resting on her belly as she felt the steady reminder of why she always chose control over chaos, because every decision now carried more than her own future. The phone beside her buzzed softly with messages, not panic-filled or dramatic, but precise, confirming that the video had spread further than anyone expected, crossing platforms, crossing borders, crossing into conversations about power, race, and who society chooses to protect. Inside the luxury store, the atmosphere had shifted completely, the polished calm replaced by tight smiles and forced politeness, as staff were pulled into meetings and lawyers, names were whispered in corners like prayers. Claire Whitlock sat alone in the manager's office, staring at her reflection in the glass wall, replaying the moment again and again, telling herself it had been justified, that rules were rules, that she had only done her job, yet her hands shook, because deep down she knew the truth had been caught too clearly to be rewritten. Emails from head office arrived with cold language and no warmth, requesting full reports, suspending decision-making authority, reminding her that brands valued image above loyalty and that liability had no favorites. Customers cancelled appointments, influencers posted statements about dignity and respect, and the store that once felt like her kingdom now felt like a courtroom waiting to pass sentence. Naomi met with people who spoke softly but carried weight, listening more than talking, letting facts speak instead of anger, because she understood that the strongest pressure is applied quietly and precisely. She did not need to raise her voice or threaten, because systems respond fastest when truth is undeniable and consequences are inevitable. Claire attempted to call contacts she once believed were unbreakable shields, but calls went unanswered or were returned with careful distance, support turning conditional, then disappearing altogether. Security footage was officially requested, statements were collected, and the word investigation began appearing in subject lines that made Claire's chest tighten with fear she had never felt before. Naomi walked through her day calmly, attending appointments, answering messages, protecting her peace, because she knew storms are loud but outcomes are decided in silence. The public conversation grew, not just about one slap in one store, but about how often prejudice hides behind professionalism and how many times people are told to endure humiliation quietly. Claire watched the news that evening, seeing her own store blurred behind headlines about discrimination and abuse of authority, and for the first time she realized this was no longer about her intentions, but about her actions. Naomi sat by the window as the city lights came on, thinking about how many people had watched the video and felt seen, how many had lived similar moments without cameras or justice, and she promised herself that this would not end with apologies or settlements alone. If you are still watching and wondering how far accountability can really go when power meets truth, make sure you subscribe and comment accountability, because the next chapter reveals how silence turns into justice and arrogance meets its final reckoning. The final reckoning arrived quietly, not with shouting or chaos, but with official emails, closed doors, and decisions made far above the polished counters where arrogance once felt untouchable. Naomi Rivers sat calmly at her kitchen table as messages confirmed what she already sensed, that the investigation was complete, that the footage had been verified, that statements from staff and witnesses aligned, and that the truth could no longer be softened or denied. Inside the luxury brand's headquarters, executives reviewed the evidence with cold precision, understanding that this was no longer a single incident, but a reflection of values they could not afford to be associated with, especially in a world that was finally watching more closely. Claire Whitlock was called into a meeting without ceremony, no assistance, no sympathetic smiles, just legal language and clear outcomes. As she was informed that her role had been terminated effective immediately, her authority revoked, her reputation damaged beyond repair by her own hand. The tailored suits and confident posture could not save her now, because power built on prejudice collapses the moment accountability arrives. News broke quickly, headlines shifting from shock to consequence, and the same voices that once dismissed Naomi now spoke about respect, safety, and responsibility, proving how fast opinions change when truth is undeniable. Naomi declined interviews that sought drama, choosing instead to release a short statement about dignity, safety, and the need for spaces where no one is judged before they are heard. The brand issued public apologies, promised training, reforms, and oversight, but the real change was not in press releases. It was in the message sent to every worker who thought cruelty could hide behind rules. Claire packed her office in silence, avoided eye contact, and for the first time understood what it felt like to be stripped of assumed belonging, realizing too late that the pain she caused had traveled far beyond a single moment. Naomi walked through her days with steady grace, supported by those who knew her strength was never loud but always deliberate, knowing that justice is not revenge but correction. Messages poured in from strangers across the country who said they felt seen, who said they had stayed silent in similar moments, who said this story gave them courage to speak, to record, to refuse humiliation. Naomi smiled softly at those messages, resting a hand on her belly, understanding that the world her child would enter had not changed completely, but it had shifted, even if only a little. The lesson was clear and undeniable, that respect is not granted by wealth or position, but by humanity, that silence is not weakness but strategy, and that prejudice always leaves fingerprints when it turns into action. And if this story reminded you that courage can be calm, justice can be quiet, and truth always finds its moment, remember this lesson and share it, because the world changes when people stop excusing cruelty and start holding it accountable.